Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about how to dig deep with symbolism. Now a lot of people know what symbolism is. They say, well, that's when you have an concrete object representing an abstract idea. And that's all well and good. Some people also might be able to go a step farther with symbolism, and they can tell you, well, I know that a heart represents love, or I know that this bracelet in the story represents a relationship between two people. And, that's even better. They're able to find a symbol in a story. But what we often struggle with is how do we dig deep into a story with symbolism? And I'm going to give you the way that I go about expanding symbolism into something that is a little bit more impactful. And in order to do this, we're going to be working with the story, The Scarlet Ibis, which if you haven't read, don't worry, I'll still give you enough information so that you can finish it. But if you're in my class, you've definitely read it. So here is the Scarlet Ibis. And we're going to take a pretty small symbol in the story just so you guys can get an idea of how this works. And the symbol that we're going to use is the go-kart. So the first thing that I do is I take a two-sided chart. So a chart with just two columns. And I list my symbol here. And for now, I'm going to completely ignore the other side, which is what this is going to symbolize. And I'm just going to fill in this side of the chart with as much detail as I can. And don't worry about getting too much detail on the side. You really can't get too much detail on this side. So when I'm going to fill in this side, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be finding the key instances where the go-kart is mentioned. And the first thing that you're going to want to find is the very first place the go-kart is mentioned. So I search through my story and I search and I search and I search. And the first place the go-kart is mentioned is when our character Doodle, they find that he is going to survive. So Doodle is going to survive. He was very sick when he was born, and you know what? They know he's going to survive. And so they talk about right after that happens, they find out that he can crawl but not walk. And so his dad builds the go-kart. Now, this is the first place it's really talked about. And if you're ever told who builds it, that can often have a big impact on its meaning. So I have my first instance and a little bit of even the before, because a little bit of the before can give me an idea as to the go-kart's role in this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through chronologically until it's done. I'm going to pick what I consider kind of like key instances where it's mentioned. It's mentioned that the narrator of the story has to cart his brother around. He has to pull Doodle. But you also find that they start spending more time together because Doodle demands to go everywhere with him. So more time together. And going even further, we find out that they end up, even though the narrator was annoyed, he comes to kind of be resigned to it. He comes to like it even. And finally, I'm going to go all the way up until the last place that it's talked about. And that's going to be another key instance. In the first and last place a symbol is talked about usually are going to give you some of the framework and really some of the biggest clues as to what the symbol means. And the last place that this symbol is talked about is when they put away this. Doodle learns to walk. So something that happens right before this event that's not directly incorporated with the go-kart. And so they put it in the barn loft. And there's an interesting little quote here about that. And it just says, it's still there. And in that loft, by the way, we do have mention of the coffin that they made for Doodle when they thought he was first going to die, and that's still in the loft as well. So, okay, I have filled out my first column, and I have a few key instances, my first and last time it's mentioned, and I can fill this up with other things as well. I can fill it up with small descriptions. If I have some descriptions of the go-kart, I might put them in this side. I might also have some more specific events, like they go to Old Woman's Swamp. That could have some impact with the go-kart. But for now, I have enough that I feel like I can start looking at the second part. And that is, what does the go-kart symbolize? So when I'm looking at what it symbolizes, I'm going to kind of consider, what does it really stand in for? I look at who built it or where it came from and try to come up with what else in the story has a similar feeling with description. And I know that this go-kart has something to do with Doodle and has something to do with kind of his life, right? Because it's allowing him to do more things. Not only does it have something to do with Doodle, but we know that his dad built it. So it's not really Doodle's entirely, right? It's built for him by his family. And really what this go-kart symbolizes is the family's expectation for him. So the family's expectations of Doodle, and these start right here. We can see that the family's expectation originally before was that he died, but the go-kart is this new expectation, right? Because he lived. Then you now have to come up with new expectations for him. And these new expectations are still limited, right? Because it's not just that he's now just the same as them. It's believed that he can't walk. So he's not going to be quite normal yet. And so I'm just kind of translating what these things mean now in the context of the family's expectations. And a lot of times it's nice to take the overall action and kind of look at that in the idea of expectations. So for instance, the narrator has to pull Doodle the entire time. So these go-karts make it so that the narrator has to be around Doodle. So this new expectation means that Doodle's going to be spending time with the narrator, right? And that's going to be what I fill in here. So now, with these new expectations, Doodle is spending more time with them. But not only is Doodle spending more time with them, but the narrator is pulling Doodle. And that means that this is a sort of expectation that is not going to be without its limitations. And we kind of already talked about that, but there's a limitation here. And it's also something that is seen as a burden for the narrator. He has to pull him, right? This new expectation comes with a sense of burden. And I'm going to actually jump to this one because this is kind of in that same vein. Because we now know that Doodle's going to survive, these expectations can be frustrating at times. Because it's going to take work. It takes work to change your expectations of somebody. But these new expectations also become a good thing for them. And you see the narrator slowly like spending time with Doodle and having that go-kart there, right? And you see him slowly like these new expectations and even go beyond these expectations. And that's where that last part comes together. In the last part, Doodle actually does learn to walk. His expectations that his brother has are so much higher that Doodle no longer needs the go-kart. So Doodle has exceeded or outgrown expectations. Just like he outgrew the go-kart. But this is where we have a few interesting things that really can give us some deep insight. They put it in the barn loft. So they put away their old expectations. Just like they put away the expectation that he died. But it's still there. And this is slightly dark because if you are putting aside your expectations of somebody when they exceeded what you expected them to do, and yet you don't completely let them go, you don't burn them, you don't throw them away, but you kind of hold on to them a little bit, it implies a few things. It implies that you kind of expect them to fail. It implies that you haven't really let go. You haven't let go and trusted them. And that's a pretty sad thing in this story, that they held on to it. And it's sad, but it's only sad in that one little line. And so that's where symbols can get really, really deep if you give them a chance to grow. Now, I could have found a bunch more things. In fact, I even left one here blank, though I suppose we kind of covered out up here. And that's okay. A lot of times when you guys are working with digging deep into symbolism, you can go crazy on this side, fill in tons and tons and tons and tons of details, and then pick maybe 5 different key instances where you can understand what this symbol does in regards to the idea or person it symbolizes. And that will give you kind of like a broad range to work with. And you reach one where you're like, you know, I don't really have much to say about him pulling around Doodle or spending much time with him. I can skip that and go to a different area and still have a lot of depth and growth. And maybe somebody else will fill in these ones for me and will come up with more depth where I really just focused on mostly this idea of the symbol and maybe the first one, or this idea and the burden of the narrator. So symbols can take on a life of their own. You can dig deeper and deeper and deeper, but ultimately you're going to want to fill in probably about 5 things on this side and try to get 5 at least slightly different things filled in. That is it. I would love for you guys to practice this with the scarlet ibis. And the symbols that are the key symbols, the ones that are going to have loads and loads and loads, are the scarlet ibis itself. You'll have tons of description, by the way, that can go on the left side. And the other is the storm. There is overlap between these two, and one thing that you might want to skip with the scarlet ibis is the first and last mention of it really have more to do with the right column. It's going to be more to describe it as a symbol than the scarlet ibis itself. You'll want to really start when the bird shows up in the story for your chronological left side. And one thing with the storm that you might want to check out is you might want to check out the weather in general. I am talking about the final storm, but really the symbol continues throughout the entire story. Have at it. Enjoy.